Hey, we're really glad that you're joining us today for our study of the book of Esther. This is Lesson 5, Chapter 3. So as a review, the country we're looking at is Persia, which is what we basically know now as the Middle East. The key character, there's several of them. The first one is the queen, the new queen, which is Esther. And Esther is a Jewish young woman. And of course, the king is Xerxes, or the Bible also calls him Ahasuerus. Some know him as Artaxerxes I. And then there's Mordecai, and Mordecai was the cousin of Esther, and yet he kind of raised her like an uncle, and they have a great relationship, and we'll see that even mushroom in our study here of the book of Esther. So the last lesson, here's what happened. Mordecai had been at the gate. He had some type of a big position working for the king. He was inside the king's gate, and he overheard a couple of the doorkeepers say that they were going to assassinate the king. Well, he went straight to Esther, and then Esther went to the king and told her of these two men who were planning to assassinate him. Well, the king took care of business quickly, and both of those men were hanged, and so life goes on. King Ahasuerus, like most kings during that time in the Persian Empire anyway, took very, very extreme, accurate records of events, and especially when people were faithful and loyal to them. And so he recorded all of this in his King's Chronicles. So that's what happened. So let's go ahead and look into chapter 3 of Esther, and we'll talk first of all about Haman's promotion. You know, he was like the right-hand man of the king's advisor. He was the most important man in the kingdom other than the king himself. In chapter 3, we'll read the first 6 verses, and I'll read them one at a time and make comments. And hopefully you can take notes if you wish. In verse 1, it says, "After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him." So Haman was known among the Jews as Haman the Evil. And he hated the Jews, and he was the main antagonist that we see here in the book of Esther. He came from a lineage of Jew haters. But King Ahasuerus promoted Haman because he had been very faithful and loyal to him in his kingdom. So he made him his chief advisor, we'll call him. Let's read in verse 2. "And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage." Now, Mordecai refused to bow down. There's problems here in Pleasantville, and here's the reason why. First of all, I believe that Mordecai did not like Haman because of Haman's arrogance. Not only that, Mordecai was a Jew, and he was taught from the scriptures, like all Jews, that you should not bow down to anyone other than God. And so thirdly, Mordecai, he was not in a good relationship. The mutual hate was between these two, Haman and Mordecai. The situation, when I was thinking about this, is really comparable to a German Jew who would not stand in honor of Adolf Hitler, especially when it was known to them that he was anti-Semitic. And of course, many problems arose from there. Let's read verse 3. "Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, 'Why do you transgress the king's command?' Now it happened, when they spoke to him daily and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with wrath." You imagine the anger that he had. "But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all of the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai." And I was reading about this, and so some of the history during this time tells us that there were probably 140 to 160 or 180 thousand Jews that were scattered throughout this 127 provinces. So, looking at this, reading this chapter, it's almost like reading a substitute for the name of Pharaoh. You know how Pharaoh hated the Jews and he did everything that he could to destroy them. And there's really not been a lot of times throughout history, ever since God put Israel together as a nation, the Hebrews as a nation, to where there has not been some nation or some king or some president that did not want to destroy the Jews in some way. So it's just part of the way God has allowed things to be. So this story of Haman pictures all 7 characteristics of the things that we read in Proverbs chapter 6 that the Lord hates. In Proverbs 6, if you're taking notes, verses 16 through 19, here are the actual 7 things it says that God hates, all right? A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run swift to mischief, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among the brethren. And so this pretty well depicts the person of Haman. He was a person that was evil. Now I want us to look at his evil proposal. This is going to be in the remaining verses of this chapter. So to begin with, before we read the verse, I want you to think about this with me. The attitude of Haman, not only was he arrogant, but he was very, very prideful. His pride was to the point to where he was so wounded to where he did not just want to destroy one man named Mordecai, but he thought, I'll destroy all of his people. I'll destroy the entire race of the Jewish people. That is a lot of hatred. That's a lot of bitterness. And so let's read as he, extends his revenge. Verse 7, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, which we would think of as March, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, that's P-U-R, that is the lot, before Haman, to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Now, this is really kind of confusing, so let me kind of divide it up this way. Nisan is the beginning of the civil year, and Adar is the ecclesiastical or the religious year, but they're both basically the same month, but we're looking at a 12-month span here. So the lot was cast. It was kind of like the throwing or the casting of dice to determine of which day to wipe out the Jews. Casting lots was used during that time by Jewish people to determine God's will. It was kind of like, okay, God, we're gonna throw these stones, and they're marked in different ways. We're gonna throw them out there, and you kind of direct us to the proper stone that we're supposed to pay attention to being your will. That's kind of how it worked. Now, non-believers in casting lots was kind of like they were seeking astrological guidance, from the stars and from the universe. However, in the casting of those stones per casting lots, this unique situation was guided by the control of God. Proverbs 16:33, I thought this was an interesting verse. It says, the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. And that was certainly the case in this situation. So this gave the Jews almost 1 year to prepare themselves for destruction. They were able to prepare themselves, to train, to coordinate with each other of ways they would protect their village, protect their individual cities. And so God gave them a year during this entire time of waiting. So the Lord was in control, and all of this is what is known today as the Feast of Purim. Maybe you've heard of that or read of that, because there are many of the Orthodox Jews who still celebrate the Feast of Purim. And so that is in honor of the casting of lots by Haman that God allowed to be under his control to give the Jewish people time so they would not be totally destroyed. So, you'll also read, if you do any study on this, that archaeologists tell us that they have found in Susa, this capital, and other places around there, many, many stones that were used in casting lots. So it was probably some of the ones like they found during our day and time now are like the exact same stones that they casted lots here during this time in the book of Esther. So let's keep moving here. We're going to look in verses 8 and 9 rather, Haman's evil request. It reads like this. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, and now notice as we read, notice how he states it. There's a certain people scattered and dispersed throughout all the kingdom and all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. And you read this, there's a certain people. He did not come out and just mention the Jews by name. And if you read any of the history of King Xerxes, you'll find that his predecessors, Cyrus and Darius the First, they had even issued some proclamations that were favorable of the Jewish people. So maybe Haman was kind of laying light in the language and, not wanting to come out and say Jews, so it might kind of ruin his plan. So the Jews, they were not doing anything to endanger the king or his kingdom. They were not rebellious. They were a separate people, but they weren't doing anything harmful to the king nor what he was trying to propagate as far as his leadership. Basically, Haman was saying that the Jews do not acknowledge you as sovereign king, Xerxes. And so he was trying to get him all upset so it would go along with his plan. This was certainly an unjustified ethnic cleansing, and that's what Haman wanted. Let's read verse 9. He said, if it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed. And notice what he says here. He's trying to maneuver and work the king here. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. Now, I want you to think about that. 10,000 talents of silver. 10,000 talents of silver is around $4.5 billion. He didn't have that kind of money. So how could he promise that he was going to place that amount of money into the king's treasury for the king to use? How was he going to do that? Well, that sum of money would be gathered as plunder from all the Jews they would kill, and he had estimated that it would be about that much money that he'd be able to take and probably reach in his hand and take some out for himself and then give a large sum to the king's treasury. Well, the king gave him permission. Let's begin reading in verse 10. So the king took his signet ring from his hand, and he gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. I think it's interesting how the Bible just comes right out here and says the enemy of the Jews. His dad was the enemy of the Jews. And it says, and the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you, to do with them as seems good to you. So here's what we have here. The king took off his signet ring, which was used to stamp and seal official documents, gave it to Haman and said, use this as you see necessary. He was giving Haman the permission to execute the Jews and to confiscate all of their wealth. Haman, I, King Ahasuerus, give you permission to annihilate these people. That's basically what he was saying. We read in verse 12. Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded to the king's satraps, which was like a viceroy, kind of a little bit higher than a governor. Then it reads, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus, it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces, notice, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. Verse 14. A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. Certainly they were perplexed. This was frightening, alarming news. It was very official. It was bad news. There was trouble in Pleasantville. There was trouble for every Jewish family. Now, what can we learn from this section of the book? Well, I don't want to share that with you at this time, so we'll look at that the next lesson. Let me give you just a little bit. First of all, let me give you 3 thoughts really quickly. What can we learn from Mordecai? Never forget that when God is blessing you, there's always going to be someone out there who is going to try to step in the way because they will resent your devotion to God. There's different reasons, right? Okay, what do we learn from Haman? We learn never underestimate the power of demonic revenge, because that's what this is. What do we learn from Ahasuerus? We learn to never overestimate the value of our own importance. We're all important, but none of us are replaceable. So with all of this said and done, here's what we find. We find that God's timing is always perfect, that He is in control, and we find out that God will even use injustice to fulfill the thing that He's wanting to do in the lives of His people. Have a blessed week, and join us next time for the next lesson.